History's most dangerous counterfeiters were rarely career criminals. They were a housewife, a shopkeeper, and prisoners behind painted windows. One $50 bill failed on a wet bar counter, 5-pound notes came out of a kitchen, and one wartime operation produced more than a tenth of Britain's circulating banknotes, printed by prisoners who tried to slow the work. The $50 painting. A wet bar counter in Lower Manhattan ended one of the strangest cases in American money. Cashiers and bartenders judged a bill mostly by how it looked and felt at a glance, and a note that passed that glance moved on without a second look. In late March 1896, a quiet immigrant named Emanuel Ninger ordered a glass of Rhine wine in a saloon on Cortlandt Street and laid a $50 note on the spilled beer. The saloon keeper examined the damp bill more closely and saw the ink come away from the paper. For years, counterfeit notes attributed to an unknown artist called Jim the Penman had been appearing, while investigators still did not know who made them. Ninger produced his counterfeits individually by hand, spending weeks on a single note, which left detectives almost nothing to trace. It was like a signature approved because it looked right, with no one checking whether the ink underneath was genuine. A $50 note in 1896 carried roughly the buying power of 2,000 of today's dollars, and even that one note only traveled because it passed a glance. He was arrested within the hour. Court records show a 6-year sentence, of which he served roughly 4. Years of careful, invisible work fell apart over one puddle of spilled beer. The kitchen iron fortune. 7 years before anyone came for her, Mary Butterworth was already running a trade from a kitchen in Rehoboth in the Massachusetts colony. Paper money issued by the colonies was an ordinary and trusted way to pay for goods, and Rhode Island notes moved through the region without much question because so few people ever compared a suspect note against the original plate. Starting around 1716, Butterworth used an ordinary household process to copy Rhode Island 5-pound notes and destroyed the temporary materials afterward, leaving investigators almost nothing to seize. It was like a check no one could set beside a master copy. If the paper looked and felt right, it was treated as real. Her brothers and other relatives sold the copies through the family for about half of face value, roughly £2 10 shillings on a 5-pound note, which by conservative colonial-era estimates comes to several $100s in today's money. The case broke open in Newport in the summer of 1723, when an accomplice described her method to investigators. At trial that August, the prosecution failed for lack of hard evidence, and Butterworth was not convicted. Colonial law knew how to hang someone caught holding an engraved plate. It had no answer for a woman whose evidence had already gone into the fire. She lived on as a respectable churchgoer and died free in 1775 at 88. The 1-cent weapon. Every souvenir hunter in Philadelphia knew the stationery shop at 403 Chestnut Street. Confederate paper money was printed to a fixed government design and accepted at face value across the South, and almost no one there expected to see that same design for sale in a Union city. Through 1862 and 63, Samuel Upham openly sold printed facsimiles of Confederate notes at about a penny apiece. Intermediaries altered some copies and carried them south, where they circulated as genuine Confederate money. It was like a museum souvenir someone later tried to spend as the real thing at a counter. By Upham's own later account, he sold more than 1.5 million facsimile notes worth near 15 million Confederate dollars, in the range of 300 million of today's dollars, though the figure rests on his own record-keeping. His copies entered a Southern economy already strained by shortages and heavy wartime printing, adding one more source of distrust in the money people carried. Union agents confirmed Upham had never forged United States currency, and the War Department closed the matter. Upham later boasted that the Confederacy had put a bounty on his head, though no order proving that claim has ever been found. The only government that truly wanted him stopped was the one his pennies kept undermining. Born the day Lincoln died. On the morning of April 14, 1865, Americans mostly trusted the young national paper currency introduced 2 years earlier to replace a patchwork of separate state banknotes. That trust had a hole in it. The hand engraving skill that had forged state bills for decades worked just as well on the new federal design, and no single agency yet chased counterfeiters across state lines. By the government's later estimate, somewhere between a third and half of the paper money in American pockets was fake. One counterfeiter, Pete McCartney, built a reputation on that hole, reportedly passing close to $100,000 in forged bills, several million in today's money, and repeatedly slipping custody. That morning, Treasury Secretary Hugh McCulloch brought Lincoln a plan for an anti-counterfeiting force. McCulloch later recalled Lincoln simply telling him he had the right idea and should work it out his own way. No document was signed. That evening, Lincoln left for Ford's Theater. It was like handing every town its own private currency and asking strangers to tell them apart on sight. The agency his approval set in motion opened on July 5th under its first chief, William Wood, and his men shut down roughly 200 underground print shops within a year. Presidential protection became a formal duty only after McKinley was shot in 1901. The agency had begun as a force against counterfeit money. The Devil's Workshop. The windows of Block 19 at Sachsenhausen were painted white from the inside. British banknotes above the smallest denominations were widely trusted as nearly impossible to copy, backed by paper and engraving standards the Bank of England had refined for generations. From 1942 to 1945, 142 prisoners pulled from the camps for their skills in engraving, printing, and banking worked behind those painted windows on an operation that produced close to £134 million, worth several billion pounds by rough modern estimates, more than a tenth of all British banknotes then in circulation. Under Major Bernhard Kruger, the prisoners also made freshly printed notes look as though they had already circulated. Bank of England museum records state the prisoners tried to delay the project at personal risk. What gave the operation away was its numbering system, an unresolved weakness that bank staff used to spot fakes among genuine notes. It was like a library where every book carried its own catalog number, and two books sharing one number gave the forgery away before anyone read a page. Most of the remaining counterfeit notes are thought to have been dumped into Lake Toplitz as German defeat became inevitable. The Bank of England had already withdrawn every denomination above £5. Higher value notes returned only decades later, with far more sophisticated designs built to prevent it happening again. The chemist who printed bonds. William Brockway studied chemistry at Yale, then spent roughly 50 years turning that training against the United States Treasury. Government bonds were treated as the safest paper in the country because clerks judged them by comparing fine engraved details against the genuine printing plate. Brockway's forgeries were detailed enough to pass that comparison, working chiefly in $1,000 bonds worth roughly 33,000 of today's dollars apiece. It was like a museum guard checking a painting against a master photograph. Close enough in every visible line, and the copy went through. Secret Service Chief William Wood arrested him in 1868. In 1880, Brockway and two associates were caught with counterfeit government bonds. One associate cooperated with investigators, and Brockway was convicted. Investigators later suggested some of his plates may have traced back to stolen Treasury material, though that link was never confirmed. In 1895, agents arrested him again and recovered $600,000 in counterfeit notes, worth roughly 24 million of today's dollars. That conviction brought him 10 years, most of which he served, with an early release in 1904 for good behavior. He lived out the rest of his life a free man, dying in 1920. The count nobody could catch. Federal agents kept a thick file on a confidence man who signed hotel registers as Count Victor Lustig. Genuine $100 bills were judged mostly by print quality and feel, and once a forged note matched that standard closely enough, it moved through a cash register like any other. Through the early 1930s, counterfeit bills tied to Lustig's operations spread across the country while a partner ran the presses and Lustig kept the money moving, smooth enough that agents rarely got close. It was like an inspector who only checked the label on a crate, never what was packed inside. Warrants aged and stakeouts came up empty, while shopkeepers and clerks who took the bad bills lost real money at the worst possible time, in the middle of the Depression. In 1935, agents acted on an anonymous tip reportedly placed by a mistress who had learned Lustig was unfaithful. When they finally caught him, they recovered $51,000 in counterfeit cash, roughly 1.2 million of today's dollars. Lustig briefly escaped custody down a rope of bed sheets and was recaptured within weeks. Between the original charge and the escape, the count who had talked his way past bankers and federal agents for years was sentenced to 20 years combined, most of it served at Alcatraz. Mr. 880. In January 1948, boys playing on a vacant lot near Broadway and 96th Street were using strange dollar bills as poker stakes. Crude notes with a blurred portrait, some spelling the first president's name, Washington. A $1 bill drew far less scrutiny than a 50 or 100, since the loss from any single fake was small. For a full decade, case number 880 followed a counterfeiter whose losses stayed small and scattered, almost impossible to trace. It was like a toll booth that waved cars through for spare change while watching every large bill closely. A kitchen fire that December ended it. Firefighters tossed the tenant's belongings out a window onto the lot, and the plates landed where children later found them. The counterfeiter turned out to be Emmerich Jutner, also known as Edward Mueller, a 73-year-old widower and junk collector who had spent roughly $1 a day of his own forgeries, about 14 of today's dollars, just to get by. In court, he pointed out that nobody had ever lost more than a single dollar to him. The judge gave him a year and a day, of which he served about 4 months, plus a fine of exactly $1. Hollywood later bought his story for the film, and by most accounts, the old man earned more from the movie than his press ever made him. Isaac Newton, detective. The most relentless detective in London had already reinvented physics. Gold coins were trusted because official mint dies and precisely milled edges were supposed to make convincing copies nearly impossible outside the mint. In 1696, Isaac Newton took charge there just as England's coinage was being eaten away by clippers and counterfeiters, and the boldest was William Challoner. Challoner forged golden guineas, French pistoles, and lottery tickets, producing counterfeit currency worth something in the range of £30,000 across his career. By modern estimates, several million pounds today, though exact conversions are debated. It was like a locked mint with one counterfeit die working just outside its walls, close enough to the real dies that most people never noticed the difference. His nerve went further than his forgeries. Challoner petitioned Parliament to be hired into the mint, arguing that only he understood its weaknesses well enough to guard against them. Newton answered by building a case the way he built proofs, working through informants and interviews until he assembled more than 140 surviving witness statements. By early 1699, Challoner sat in Newgate prison while that case closed around him. He was executed at Tyburn on March 22, 1699, still insisting from the scaffold that he had been condemned unjustly. The man who asked to guard England's money was hanged by the mind that had just finished explaining how the planets move. If one of these hunts stayed with you, say which one in the comments and subscribe for more true stories from the history of money.